President Trump, of course, yesterday confirming that he told Democratic Minority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer that he is prepared to keep the shutdown going for what he claimed are months or even years, though the latter is doubtful. And as he raises the possibility of invoking presidential powers to declare a national emergency in order to get that wall built, what are those powers invested in the chief executive? And does the president really have to wait for Congress to fund it, something the Democratic House is refusing to do? Our first guest attended yesterday's Rose Garden news conference. He is Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason. And Jeff joins us, as you can see, from the north lawn of the White House right now. So, Jeff, let's start with a national emergency. What would it mean if the president, for the purposes of building this wall, would declare a national emergency?
Well, number one, it would mean that the president would invoke certain powers that he believes would allow him to go around Congress and not require their approval for funding for the wall. How exactly that would work is not entirely clear. Previous presidents have used emergency powers or declared a national emergency during times of war. Clearly, that's something that the president is thinking about because he addressed it in that press conference yesterday. But how exactly it would work, I'm not in a position to say.
Yeah, I mean, they've also been used for, economic issues, for oil and for other supports and price supports and this sort of thing. Let's take a look at 2 points of the law, as has been pointed out, that gives the president this type of power. 10 U.S.C. 284 basically directs the defense secretary to, quote, provide support for the counter-drug activities or activities to counter transnational organized crime of any department or agency of the federal government. Then there's a U.S.C. 2808. The Secretary of Defense, without regard to any other provision of the law, may undertake military construction projects and may authorize the secretaries of the military departments to undertake military construction projects. Such projects may be undertaken only within the total amount of funds that have been appropriated for military construction. So, Jeff, would that possibly mean if they have $1 to $2 billion, it's believed, in military outlays that they already have in hand for construction, the president has the power to move that $2 billion from whatever projects they have on military bases to the wall?
Well, that's a good question, and it would be in line with what the president has said before, which is that he might use military funding for that. He has certainly envisioned a role for the military at the border and could do so with the wall and in finding the money to pay for that wall. Again, this was his really big campaign promise, primary significant campaign promise from 2016. We're about 2 years into his presidency right now, and he's clearly drawing a line in the sand and saying, I'm willing to do anything I have to do to make sure I get that, whether it's through negotiations with Democrats and Republicans from the Hill or through extraordinary measures.
And if he does take that extraordinary measure, it would likely be challenged in court. And also critics are saying, it's autocratic, it's like a dictatorship. It certainly would be like almost a threat to democracy. I mean, does that hold any water, or is it's in the presidential powers?
Well, it would almost certainly be challenged in court. You're absolutely right about that. And, the people who are very passionate about having this wall, including the president and his staff and people around him, are matched by the people who are equally passionate about not having it. And both sides would work very hard either to get it or to prevent it if the president were to try to use presidential powers to make it happen.
Meanwhile, I've had several meetings, one in the Situation Room and others. Certainly the telephone lines are burning up. And we just had the meeting wrapping up a moment ago at the old executive office building next to you.
That's right.
What happened, and what do you think will come out of it?
Well, we're not sure what's happened because no one is, at least the White House officials I've reached out to, haven't come back with any particular details on it yet. We saw who was involved in the meeting, Vice President Pence leading those talks, as well as the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, Jared Kushner also along. From the congressional side, there were congressional aides. And so it's unclear. It's also not clear if they're coming back today or if they were just breaking for lunch or if they're done for the day. Bottom line is, if they're going to find a compromise, we expect it to be somewhere between that $1.3 billion that Democrats have already offered for border funding versus the $5.6 billion that the President Trump says he needs to build that wall. Whether or not they're able to find a compromise on that figure, somewhere in between, that's the million-dollar question, or the multi-billion-dollar question right now.
Exactly. I mean, what do you think will happen? How can it thread that needle? I mean, the Democrats, will they say, well, it's a fence, they don't want a wall, or the president can then claim whatever it is, the barriers with the slats, that would be a wall. Here we're showing video right now with the vice president, followed by Jared Kushner there, leaving that meeting, obviously, in some discussions. Jeff, how do you think this will end because it's got to.
Yeah, and I wish I knew the answer to that. You know, I think that they will continue to talk. There's no question about that. Both sides have said they don't want the government to be shut down. But the president, of course, saying that it could stay shut down as long as years. He's only got 2 years left in his term. I think it's pretty hard to imagine that the government would stay shut down that long. But that's his way of saying I'm really serious about this. Democrats, on the other hand, are serious about it as well. Nancy Pelosi has just become Speaker of the House, and she and her caucus don't have an incentive to change what they think is a critical issue, and that is to not give funding to this wall, which, as she has said in the last few days, she does not consider a moral issue.
Oh, something's got to give, and we'll see what that is. Jeff, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us outside today on the
My
North
pleasure.
Lawn, of course.